Why regional water gaps are now an ESG compliance problem. There's a growing mismatch between how companies talk about water risk and how they actually manage it. In sustainability reports and investor presentations, water stewardship sounds careful and considered. In practice, most companies are working from facility level data that is incomplete, supply chain water exposure that is unmapped, and regional projections that were last updated before the current wave of regulatory change. That mismatch is becoming harder to sustain. In 2026, the pressure to close it is coming from multiple directions at once, and they're not all moving at the same pace. The disclosure gap is opening up faster than most teams expected. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD, is now requiring European companies and multinationals operating in Europe to report on water consumption, withdrawal, and stress exposure under the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, ESRS. Water is not buried in a general environmental section. It has its own standard, E3, with specific disclosure requirements around material water-related risks and dependencies. For companies that have treated water as a secondary ESG metric, something tracked but not prioritized, ESRS E3 is a forcing function. It requires companies to assess where they are drawing water from, whether those sources are under stress, and what the business exposure to water scarcity actually looks like. Estimated and qualitative disclosures are no longer sufficient. According to CDP's latest water security disclosures, more than 3,000 companies report water-related risks, but only a minority say they conduct detailed basin or watershed-level risk assessments across their operations, an approach considered essential for identifying site-specific exposure. Companies without that data are not just behind on reporting, they're behind on the underlying risk picture, where the stress is actually concentrated. Data from the World Resources Institute's Aqueduct Water Risk Atlas shows that water stress and supply risks vary widely by watershed and region, often creating localized exposure that broad corporate water risk frameworks fail to capture. Extremely high water stress now covers parts of South Asia, the Middle East, North Africa, and Sub-Saharan Africa, regions that are also home to significant manufacturing, agriculture, and extractive industry supply chains. But the stress maps also extend into Southern Europe, the US, Southwest, and parts of Central Asia in ways that directly implicate operations that companies assumed were in low-risk geographies. The practical problem is that corporate risk assessments tend to use country-level or regional average data, which smooths out the local variation that actually drives operational risk. A company may show low aggregate water exposure at the portfolio level while having individual facilities or critical suppliers sitting on highly stressed local watersheds. India, one of the world's largest manufacturing centers for electronics, textiles, and pharmaceuticals, faces widespread water stress. National and international assessments indicate that more than half of the country's regions are already experiencing high or extremely high levels of water scarcity. Companies sourcing from Indian facilities without site-specific water assessments are carrying risk that isn't in their numbers. Supply chain is where the accountability gap is largest. Most companies have reasonable visibility into their own operational water use. Fewer have meaningful insight into Tier 1 supplier water exposure, and almost none have mapped water risk through to Tier 2 and Tier 3 supply chains. That's where the concentration of risk tends to sit, in the agricultural inputs, raw materials, and component manufacturing that sits behind the first layer of commercial relationships. The pressure to close this gap is coming from buyers as much as regulators. A growing number of large multinationals are incorporating water risk into supplier qualification frameworks, particularly in sectors where water is a direct input or where supply chain disruption from water scarcity has already been experienced. If your company sits in those supply chains as a supplier, water risk management is becoming a commercial prerequisite, not just a reporting exercise. What sustainability leaders need to do before year-end. The most important shift is moving from portfolio-level water reporting to watershed-level risk assessment. Tools like WRI Aqueduct and the Alliance for Water Stewardship Standard provide structured frameworks for doing this. It requires investment in data, in engagement with local water users and regulators, and in internal capacity. But the alternative is continuing to report figures that don't reflect where the actual risk sits. Sustainability teams need to get ahead of the CSRD E3 timeline, even if their company is not yet within scope. The standard is effectively becoming a global reference point. Investors, large buyers, and ratings agencies are already using ESRS E3 logic to frame water-related questions, regardless of whether a company has formal reporting obligations. Connect water risk explicitly to your materiality assessment. In many companies, water appears in the sustainability section, but hasn't been translated into the financial materiality language that boards and audit committees actually respond to. That translation is the job of sustainability leadership in 2026, and the window for doing it proactively, rather than reactively, is narrowing. The bigger picture: regional water disparities aren't going to even out. Climate projections consistently show that the areas under the most water stress will become more stressed, and that the geographic concentration of that stress will intersect directly with where global supply chains are built. Companies that treat water risk as an ESG checkbox are going to look increasingly out of step with both the regulatory expectations and the operational reality. The ones who get this right won't just have better disclosures. They'll have better supply chains, fewer operational surprises, and more credible conversations with the investors and customers who are now asking the questions that matter. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.